I want to welcome you to this evening's presentation. We are so fortunate to have our friend Dr. Chris Ford be our guest this evening, and I'll mention what he's talking about here in just a minute. My name is Jeff O'Keefe. I'm the Executive Director of Zen Peacemakers, and I welcome you and thank you for spending part of your evening with us. Dr. Ford is going to talk about the Dharma of Deterrence, a Zen practitioner's reflections on 2 decades in the weapons of mass destruction world. And Dr. Ford is a former Assistant Secretary of State. And as we were just talking about before we opened up to everyone, he lives within the Beltway, and which is unique for many of us. I live decidedly outside the Beltway at 7,000 feet in the mountains. So anyway, I will turn this over. Chris, I'll turn this over to you. And once again, thank you so much for doing this for us. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. It should be rich.
So Jeff, thanks. I just want to give a brief introduction. It's really an honor for me to introduce my friend. I love calling him Dr. Chris Ford, to the Zen Peacemaker community. I met Chris through Roshi Joan Halifax 7 years ago after she heard of my work on the right side of the aisle on behalf of climate. And she knew Chris from having his participation in her Buddhist chaplaincy training program a couple of years earlier, and thinking that it would be useful for the two of us to meet because he was a senior Republican attorney for one of the important Senate committees in DC. Chris and I immediately connected deeply, particularly as we were rare birds, being Buddhists and Republicans or conservatives. So we had a little caucus of two for a while. I hope you had a chance to see his impressive resume. But let me quickly recap. Since 1997, Chris has spent most of his career working on behalf of our country in public service roles as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Naval Reserve, as a diplomat, as a senior staff person for various committees in the Senate, and for various administrations. He has an undergraduate degree from Harvard, a law degree from Yale, and a doctorate from Oxford in international relations. Sounds like a hat trick, Chris. He's published 3 books, and as I mentioned, he's a Buddhist chaplain. He's also an active participant in martial arts and a loving father and husband. For many people, it's hard to wrap your mind around what it is to be a Buddhist, but also work in the middle of nuclear policy. I expect some of what he has to say will be provocative, but I cannot imagine anyone better than Chris to use Buddhist teachings to navigate that very difficult area on behalf of all sentient beings. I look forward to his perspective on the Dharma of Deterrence, and I hope what will be an active Q&A. Chris, Dr. Ford, it's yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grant. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's great to talk to you all. And thanks, Jeff, and everyone else for having me speak. As a sometime student of my dear friend Roshi Joan, as you mentioned, and as a Zen practitioner who unfortunately only met Bernie Glassman on one occasion in connection with a lecture that he gave out at Upaya quite a few years ago now, it's really quite sort of humbling and a bit intimidating to be talking to the member circle at CPI. So I'm really glad, Grant, that we have your steady and reassuring hand here as our master of ceremony. So thanks for that. For my remarks, as you know, I've focused in on what I hope you guys will find to be an interesting topic, and I guess what's surely an unusual one. My reflections as a Buddhist on a career spent in the nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence business. Just for protocol purposes, these are of course only my own views. I would not dream of attributing them to anyone else, and I don't expect you'll necessarily agree with my perspectives, for they are probably pretty idiosyncratic. But I'm really grateful for the chance to engage with such a thoughtful audience, and I look forward in particular to our discussion. But let me start by just making the point that I never actually set out to get into the nuclear weapons business. If you'd asked me 20 years ago what I was professionally, I would have told you that I was a government oversight lawyer, or maybe more specifically, an intelligence oversight lawyer. In those days, I worked for Senate committees, committee staffs, including doing legal oversight of the U.S. intelligence community on the staff of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So at that time, I was, maybe 20 years ago, I was also just at that point beginning to identify as a Buddhist, having begun sitting with a Korean Zen group that was across the river, across the Potomac in Alexandria, Virginia. It was only about 2003 or so that the opportunity came along to move into the executive branch as a political appointee at the time, dealing with arms control and nuclear weapons sorts of issues. And I've been eyebrow deep in all that stuff ever since in the policy world, and a Buddhist the whole time. So that combination is a Grant, I'm sure, will smile. That combination has sometimes been, I'm sure, confusing to my friends and colleagues, both in the hawkish world of foreign and national security policy in two successive Republican presidential administrations, but also in the Buddhist community, such as at the Upaya Zen Center, where I graduated from its first chaplaincy program back in 2010. So that combination may seem a bit weird, I guess, but I guess from my perspective, I've long felt that unexpected juxtapositions can be really great opportunities for learning and for practice. I think of this a little bit as if it were almost chemistry in a sense, right? Because in chemistry, interesting reactions don't occur in the center of a homogeneous substance, but rather on its margins where it abuts something different. Homogeneous centers, if you will, are pretty static things, but boundaries are often really catalytic, and that's where interesting reactions occur. And what I think is true of chemical substances is surely true, perhaps even more so, of human cultures and subcultures. My own view is that conceptual and intellectual monocultures, if you will, tend to be pretty sterile places, whereas boundary zones are where reactions and transformations occur. So although I can't speak really frankly either to what my work in the WMD world has meant to my Buddhist friends, or my Buddhism has meant to my colleagues in the national security policy community, I think the very oddness of being a Buddhist working on WMD sorts of issues, it's certainly, as I see it at least, it's encouraged me to grapple with professional ethics on a sort of world historical scale, if you will, in ways that I probably would never have had to face otherwise. So for me, it's been, I hope, and I think, very interesting and beneficial. Whether it has been interesting and beneficial to others in engaging with me, I'm not the one to say. But in any event, as Grant alluded to, back in 2009, after I left the executive branch for the first time, I wrote an essay that was published by Upaya, very graciously, entitled Nukes and the Vow, Security Strategy as Peacework. And in that essay, I stressed what I thought was very much a challenge that I felt to me that a Buddhist faces, inherent in any act of consequential choice making, if you will. And that is the problem of reconciling the objective of preventing or relieving suffering, as we must, with the inescapability of the not knowing, if you will, that Zen peacemakers have as the first of the three tenets. In this respect, from a policymaker's perspective, Buddhist ethics, at least has always struck me at least, as being remarkably indeterminate, if that makes sense, when it comes to the complexities of operational policy decisions, if you will, in the policy arena. Buddhist ethics may say a great deal about where you should be coming from in doing policymaking, that is to say, where your heart is and where your heart should be. But that's not the same thing as prescribing exactly where you should be going in terms of specific policy prescriptions. I think ultimately that's probably more of a feature than a bug, but it's certainly challenging, and it does demand, I would argue, a great deal of us by denying us the ability to think that we have easy and preordained answers. And I think that the tenet of not knowing just accentuates this point, reminding us that rigid certainties are the near enemy, if you will, the dark shadow side of insight. To me, this at least signals pretty clearly that seeking and adhering to fixed and rigid answers to human problems is not really skillful means. and it's not upaya. And we would surely fall into delusion and into attachment if we presumed that Buddhism confers upon us some kind of substantive infallibility or dictates every specific policy outcome. So while I would argue, we must acknowledge our inability, the fact that we cannot have confidence in the results of our choices, which is the aspiration of any policymaker, right? As a policymaker, my job is to convince whoever I'm speaking with that I have the right answer that's going to produce the outcome that we all desire. But I think not knowing forces us to confront the possibility that that's really not necessarily true. It's not even clear that we can have confidence in whether we have actually understood the real problem we need to solve in the first place. So those are huge challenges from a policymaking perspective that we are confronted with by the very self-awareness of being, I would like to think, a good Buddhist. And it's also true that we don't have the luxury of not making a choice either. So deliberate inaction, of course, is just another species of action, and that will, of course, itself most assuredly have consequences. And we are bound by the Bodhisattva Vow to at least try to alleviate suffering, even though we are, of course, highly fallible creatures. So where does that leave us? And that's the challenge that I have always felt very acutely struggling with in the policy world. In the thesis, for this very reason, in the thesis that I wrote for Upaya's chaplaincy program, which so somewhat weirdly they put online, I described the very active policy choice and policymaking as being almost a kind of koan in itself. We are bound by the vow to try to alleviate suffering, but we're denied clarity about what's actually going to achieve that end, even as we are also denied the option of avoiding that tough question. So that's a tough dilemma, it seems to me, especially for those of us whose profession is to supposedly offer policy answers to pressing problems in the world. And it leaves us in rather a difficult spot. What is a policymaker to do? And how can you bring this struggle in a useful and constructive way into the arena, for example, in my case, of nuclear weapons related policymaking? And that's a hell of a thing. Now, my tentative answers to this may or may not persuade you, of course, but I did at least try to come at these questions by, at the very least, trying to get the objective straight, or try to ask the right questions, if you will, however hard it may be to have a lot of confidence in the answers or get to that point. So I guess in this respect, my approach to the nuclear weapons world has been governed from pretty early on by something of a break from the dominant strain of nuclear disarmament discourse in the sort of NGO world. I did not start with the assumption that the primary objective was to eliminate all nuclear weapons. That specific a policy conclusion, it felt to me at least, as I got more into the Buddhist community, that was a certainty that the first tenet of not knowing sort of kind of precluded. So what I tried to do is start by focusing upon what felt to me like an antecedent assumption or question, and one about which maybe we could perhaps have some reasonable certainty simply on the basis of our Buddhism itself. That is that the overriding objective should be to create a world that contains as little human suffering as possible. So in 2009, in that essay, I described it by saying that whatever else it might mean for a Mahayana Buddhist to seek through social action to create conditions conducive to the enlightenment of other sentient beings, that presumably includes working to ensure a relatively stable global security environment. People who are being slaughtered, for instance, face significant constraints upon their ability to engage in spiritual practice. And our compassionate objective, I would think pretty reasonably, must be to prevent or alleviate suffering. But that means that we seek a future world structured at least somehow so as to offer ever better opportunities for humans to overcome their samsaric confusion and attachment. So this kind of made the usual question, what to do about nuclear weapons, into a sort of a secondary question. And as I saw it, at least, I felt that peace and security, in the broadest sense, is sort of the public policy objective, not nuclear disarmament per se. To my eye, weapons elimination itself was one possible upaya, one possible skillful means to be used or discarded, depending upon its contribution to that that really broader goal. And to treat it as an axiom that no stable and enlightenment facilitating future world could possibly contain any nuclear weapons struck me as a form of knowing that could be delusive. I wasn't really willing to assume the necessity of eliminating such weapons any more than I was to assume the imperative of keeping them. And I tried to come at this from the perspective of trying to make Buddhist peace work mean something about fundamental human security rather than the kind of talismanic presence or absence, if you will, of any particular type of technology or device or whatever. So that's sort of where I started coming from in trying to engage with questions of nuclear deterrence and questions of whether and under what circumstances it was even possible to envision real world weapons possessors being willing to give up their weapons in the first place. And in some ways, from a policy perspective, the crucial question to my eye was, how is it that we can make the world as conducive as possible to the prevention of alleviation of suffering through that prism? What would it actually take to persuade real world decision leaders to make that call? And by the way, if they didn't do it quickly, or if they never did it, what could we do to make suffering as little likely as possible for so long as they haven't eliminated those weapons? And that's a slightly different way of framing things. And what it did for me, at least, is it felt as if it plunged me into, I mean, this is not just as an inside the beltway policy wonk, but actually as a Buddhist as well, into some really complex and messy questions of international security policy. These things are matters that are, they're fundamentally contested, they're contingent, they're fraught, they're ambiguous, they're complicated. They're about how to manage and shape risks and challenges that are inherent in a multiplayer game, an environment of power, competition, bureaucracy, technology, politics, emotion, ambition, all those things, right? These are really tough, challenging, complex things that really don't conduce to simple answers. But these were the kinds of questions of concrete security environment management, if you will, that I didn't see at the time anybody in the sort of mainline disarmament community even trying to address. So to my eye, struggling with the complexity of security was nonetheless essential to the project of Buddhist peace work. And we could scarcely hope to ensure a more genuinely peaceful world unless we grappled with such things. So that was one of the things that I tried to stress in that early 2009 essay, and another one that same year, in which I urged the disarmament community to try, as I put it, to learn to speak disarmament, if you will, in the language of security, if they wished to create the foundations for possible progress in arms reduction towards eventual nuclear weapons elimination. In that second essay, I urged all stakeholders begin a dialogue on how it might be actually possible to start creating real world security conditions that were more conducive to disarmament progress than the conditions that prevail in the world around us. What would it take to make nuclear weapons abolition at some point eventually seem like a plausible, a saleable, and a sustainable policy choice for the world's nuclear weapons possessors? I didn't presume to think that I knew the answers to that question, far from it. But it did seem clear to me that the global peace work would be, might well be doomed to failure if we weren't at least asking those kinds of questions. So as I put it in that original essay, if there is to be a chance for zero, I said, it surely lies in and through the dynamics and the complications of political life, and not in some sort of vain hope of a miraculous transcendence. Unfortunately, answers to our challenges of practice in this arena just aren't that simple. So we might have a lot of wrestling ahead of us, a lot of wrestling with these questions still to do, without there being clear answers ahead of time. But I felt like Buddhism, at least here, could function as a call to practice in doing that, or trying to do that wrestling. And if the various sides in the nuclear debate, and there are many sides to be sure, if they could at least temporarily put aside their own respective knowings, if you will, there might still be some really valuable learning that we could do along the way, including about how it might be possible to ameliorate at least some of the armament pressures that are created by a challenging security environment. And if the disarmament community really could learn, as I put it earlier, to speak disarmament in the language of security, in a language that's intelligible to real world leaders as answering or helping answer the security challenges with which they find themselves engaged. Who knew what might eventually be possible? So that was sort of how it seemed to me when I transitioned out of the State Department into the think tank world 10 years ago or so, while bouncing back and forth to New Mexico for the Upaya chaplaincy program with Roshi John. So I guess the question then, that was 10 years ago, how has that vision fared since then? And I guess to my surprise, the answer might be not too badly. After I was appointed to serve as Special Assistant to the President and to run the Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counterproliferation Directorate at the National Security Council staff in 2017, we undertook what I called a nuclear vision review to look at US disarmament policy and relations with the disarmament community with fresh eyes. And our conclusion there was that, with which many perhaps didn't agree, but our conclusion was that the approaches to nuclear disarmament that had become the conventional wisdom since the end of the Cold War had by that point run out of steam. Now, of course, it had been possible, and this is a really important point, it had been possible to make very significant disarmament progress after the end of the Cold War, since neither Washington nor Moscow at that point felt that they needed the huge arsenals that both had amassed during their period of global strategic rivalry. That easing of tension and that strengthening of trust between the two superpowers in the sort of late 1980s, the early 1990s, that made possible some really enormous disarmament progress in the form of huge nuclear weapons reductions, to the point that the current size of the US nuclear arsenal is only about 10% of its Cold War peak. Now, that's still a lot of weapons, I'll grant you, but a cut of 90% is not something to sneeze at in any respect. And indeed, we stand now at the smallest size of our nuclear arsenal since Dwight Eisenhower was the US president. The problem, however, was that with those surplusages from the Cold War now having been eliminated, and the security environment, as we unfortunately can all tell from headlines and things, the security environment not improving further, but perhaps actually worsening, the post-Cold War disarmament approach seemed to us to have stopped producing results. Our conclusion was that those approaches probably simply couldn't work anymore because they'd run up against the intellectual internal contradiction of their own assumption that pushing for disarmament agreements would produce lessened security tensions rather than the other way around. And as we saw it, as I certainly saw it, maybe things actually really did work the other way around. You got to the reductions because there was a lessening of tension. You didn't create the lessening of tension by first persuading people to reduce, because when tensions are high, you don't persuade them to reduce. So I set this all forth in a speech to the Plowshares Fund, a disarmament organization, in late 2017, when talking about the results of this review, arguing that the disarmament community's traditional post-Cold War approach, I put it, hasn't worked and probably couldn't have done so because it focused too much upon the weapons rather than upon the actual conditions under which so many countries clearly still feel the need to have such weapons. So for that reason, we felt like we needed some new thinking. And what was needed was perhaps a wisdom that had maybe been hiding in plain sight, namely that, as I indicated before, if you want to facilitate disarmament, you need to ease tensions and strengthen trust between states in a way that makes it more possible, or more and more possible, for national leaders, weapons possessors, to conclude that they need nuclear weaponry less and less. So echoing, in a sense, the 2009 essay, what we called for in that nuclear vision review in 2017 was to emphasize that friends of disarmament need to take the time to learn to speak the security languages of contemporary weapons possessors and should seek and prize deep engagement on the question of what conditions in the security environment it would take to actually facilitate the kind of disarmament movement that we would like to see. And the upshot of this was that after I moved to the State Department in the beginning of 2018, we actually led the US government in undertaking a new disarmament dialogue initiative with our foreign counterparts that focused precisely upon these kinds of questions. We came to call this the Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament Initiative, or CEND, or SEND, if you will. And so over the next 3 years, SEND pulled together a remarkably diverse coalition, if you will, of 42 countries and a handful of NGO participants to help facilitate this. These countries, these representatives came from countries that represented a really wide range of humanity's engagement with nuclear weaponry. So they brought lots of perspective to the table. There were nuclear weapons possessors represented, and non-possessors, industrialized countries and developing nations, nuclear alliance members like NATO alliance members, for example, and adherents to the nuclear weapons ban treaty, for instance, and key players from both sides of all sorts of political and ideological fault lines around the world. We had Arabs and Israelis and Indians and Pakistanis, people from Europe, East Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. It was a really diverse group, and the whole purpose of this was to get folks together to try to begin to explore what the world really does need in concrete terms of security and geopolitics in order to facilitate further disarmament progress. By the time I left office, earlier this year, of course, SEND had progressed from its initial planning phase to the point of actually seeing 3 different working groups having been set up. They had set their terms of reference and program of work, and revolving around 3 distinct questions that the participants in the process had identified as being critical to trying to meet this need and answer to meet this need, I suppose, through the SEND work program. The 3 questions were as follows. First of all, what incentives affect countries' decisions to possess or to eliminate nuclear weapons? And how might you try to change those incentives, obviously in order to make more disarmament movement possible? So it went to the incentive structure that countries faced and the basis for their decisions. The second set of questions being looked at by a second subgroup was what mechanisms can bolster non-proliferation and disarmament and could help make disarmament more sustainable once it has been achieved. That reflects the insight that the objective needs to be not simply to get the world to zero, but figure things out in a way that allows us to stay at zero. Because of course, I don't think we're going to make anyone entirely forget that nuclear weapons are possible. And the technology will be, in a sense, out there probably for the rest of time, as long as there are people. So how do you build mechanisms in place that not only that let you stay at zero once you hopefully get there? And the third question was, how do we manage and reduce nuclear risks until such point as nuclear weapons are eliminated? And that reflects the idea that it may not be tomorrow morning that this happens and we get to zero. It may be an extremely long time. You may recall that President Obama back in 2009 used the phrase, probably not in my lifetime. That may even be an understatement. I have no idea. But there will certainly be some period before elimination. And it might be a very long period. And what do we do during that time to make sure that we live as safely and securely with these technologies as we can during that hopefully interim period? So those are the 3 work streams, if you will, for the SEND initiative process with those 42 countries, meeting pretty regularly to try to begin to explore these things on a very off the record, candid Chatham House rules kind of basis. And I don't know officially whether the Biden administration has yet picked up that baton that we left them, but my informal contacts with folks indicate that indeed the new team in Washington will absolutely continue forward with SEND, with this project that we created. And I certainly wish the participants Godspeed, and I hope that their deliberations will in fact produce security-focused insights that can help make the world a safer place and that perhaps can point the way to safe and sustainable disarmament in the years ahead. So I'm very excited about that, but I'd like to emphasize to you all the degree to which this really was a linear development from some of the vision that we tried to develop, growing out of, in effect, the chemical catalytic interaction of the Upaya chaplaincy program and my very odd line of work. So what does this mean from the perspective of Buddhist peace work? Let me conclude with that. What do I think it means? Of course, I wouldn't pretend to have to violate the first tenet by claiming more knowledge than I have. But what does this feel like it means to me in this sort of fraught arena of weapons of mass destruction policy? I would say one lesson is the importance of dialogue and engagement, even with, and you might say actually especially with, those who disagree with you. Provided that, I suppose all parties have to bring some degree of good faith to the table, but the strong emphasis upon the importance of dialogue and engagement. Now, dialogue isn't a guarantee of substantive success, of course, in any respect, and certainly not in alleviating suffering in the world, as we are bound to try to do. But in a complex world of interacting stakeholders with formidable capabilities and very, very different interests and perspectives, it seems to me that you'll certainly fail without dialogue. So that's sort of the sine qua non, I suppose, of how to approach sort of geopolitical peace work in that sense. I would suggest another lesson may be that there is no necessary contradiction between Buddhist peace work and hard-nosed security politics. Now, I say this, somewhat self-interestedly, of course, having voted with my feet in this respect, but I don't think there's a contradiction intrinsically between Buddhist peace work and security politics, including nuclear deterrence. There's a stereotype of Buddhism, certainly in the West at least, and especially amongst converts like myself, that paints the Buddhist community as adamantly pacifistic and steadfastly anti-nuclear. But I suspect that we can't really fulfill the Bodhisattva vow or live up to the first tenet if we allow ourselves to get too stuck in a knowing, if you will, of that sort. That seems a bit rigid to me, but I don't think that there's any way you can really hope to answer the problems of security, including the problem of deterring aggression, and certainly not least in the nuclear arena. You can't hope to do that without being willing to take security seriously as a topic, and to engage with the issues and the complications that taking security seriously necessarily raises. The Buddhist needs to do this, I would say, with compassion, must do this with compassion in his or her heart, with an open mind and with good faith, of course. But I think we would betray our own ameliorative ideals if we don't address security, at least in part, on its own terms. And that kind of thoughtful engagement, I would say that's skillful means, that's upaya. Whereas confronting real world leaders who face or feel themselves to face security dilemmas, confronting them merely with sort of moralistic ultimata that seem to ignore those concerns that they feel so compelling, that doesn't feel very skillful to me, and may well be counterproductive. So I think you have to engage in that discourse and take it seriously to be able to make progress. I would also argue that in keeping with the first tenet, I think we also need to acknowledge that there really aren't many clear and obvious answers to the various security challenges that countries face in struggling with the world's nuclear weapons policy problems. If there were really simple, easy answers, I guess there'd be less point in dialogue. Policymaking would just be a question of browbeating everyone else into agreement with the revealed truth. But I don't think Buddhism allows us that kind of a lazy luxury of assuming that we already know all the answers and that no really genuinely difficult decisions remain to us. So we have to struggle with this. We have to take that ox by the horns. There isn't really any way around it. I don't think it's obvious how to be a good Buddhist and to conduct effective statecraft at the same time. But I think if one is frankly lucky enough to have the opportunity to make decisions of consequence, hopefully for the greater good, I think you've got to seek to do both of those things. There really isn't any way to shirk that responsibility. And I wonder whether I came across in a book not too long ago, a little anecdote that I think sort of helps illustrate this. And I wonder whether we can perhaps learn at least a little something from pre-communist Tibet, where officials confronted these kinds of dilemmas in very acute forms because they were not just religious leaders, but responsible, as was the case then, for matters of statecraft too. And in that respect, I was very struck to read the so-called Last Testament of His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama, which included the very clear exhortation that, and I'll quote you here, our political stability depends upon the devotion of the ecclesiastic and secular officials and upon their ability to employ skillfully every diplomatic and military means without any possibility of regret or failure. Now, he didn't presume to lay down specific concrete commandments for his successors or for the Tibetan government at the time, but he did exhort them very clearly to the practice of statecraft as a Buddhist practice. The skillful means of upaya that he envisioned clearly included both diplomacy and potentially, at least, even military action, when and where this might be needed to defend the country from external threats. And you can sort of see it a bit later during the final communist invasion and conquest of Tibet in 1959. The 14th Dalai Lama, his successor, took a very similar position. There's a memoir by Tsipan Shugaba. I'm sure I'm mangling his name. My apologies for that. But he was a former high official in the Tibetan government up until the end, spent some time in prison under the Chinese. But in his memoir, he recounts that as communist troops advanced, the collapsing Tibetan government sought advice from the Dalai Lama, who had by that point already escaped in exile to India. And as according to Shugaba, on March 18 of 1959, a letter arrived from His Holiness providing guidance, but it did not purport to give clear instructions other than to exhort Tibetan officials to grapple open-heartedly with the dilemmas of statecraft they faced. According to Shugaba, the Dalai Lama urged the key remaining Tibetan government officials to take up positions as generals, mind you, and to attempt to negotiate with the Chinese to preserve Tibet's freedom. This signaled that they did not have the option of refusing to engage with statecraft and with the security challenges they faced. Yet, and this is a quote from Shugaba recounting this story, if the Chinese refused to negotiate, His Holiness directed that we must deliberate profoundly amongst ourselves and come to an agreement about whether to fight or to use other methods of resistance. The Dalai Lama said he would pray for us unceasingly, but we would be unable to communicate further. It was left to us to decide upon a peaceful or a wrathful solution. Now, I would suggest that in His Holiness's own words there, as recounted by Shugaba, we have in front of us the really awesome challenge of statecraft and security through the prism of compassionate engagement. In the dissertation that I wrote for Upaya, I referred to this as the koan of policy choice. Our koan in this regard, I think, is the challenge of reconciling the tenet of not knowing with the day-to-day requirements of advocating, implementing, and defending particular policy choices against alternative courses of action, because that's, of course, what we policymakers do. And you've got to do all this in a context in which you both cannot avoid choice and in which any choice will have, including non-choice, will have very significant consequences. That is clearly heavy stuff, especially if your line of work is, as mine has for some time been, dealing with geopolitical conflicts and the policy implications of technologies that, if mishandled, could quite literally destroy human civilization. That's heavy indeed, although there isn't any alternative to throwing ourselves really headlong into such engagement. We need to embrace these dilemmas. This is our koan for practice. And I think it's among the most important sort of koan that there could possibly be in many ways, and we must not shirk it. So where this ends up taking us, I can't pretend to know. But I do think that these challenges are surpassingly important and that we humans will both suffer less and thrive more to the degree that we can bring a thoughtful, mindful, compassionate, and security-informed mindset to wrestling with such problems. That's my idiosyncratic take. I rather suspect there's a great deal in there with which you guys may take umbrage, but I would love to talk about it more, and I'm super looking forward to our discussion here today. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. I just feel even more blessed than before that we've had you in those important seats over the last 20 years to navigate this difficult area. I did find myself, and I don't mean to sort of pitch Bernie's 3 tenets a little extra, but the not knowing is a lifesaver for me as I go through each moment of the day. I found myself thinking, as you were speaking of the importance of dialogue, is that not another term for bearing witness, which of course is the second tenet? So beautiful, really beautiful. I have the ability now to see any raised hands if there are folks who have questions. Those of you who are not, don't have live video, you can send me a chat or send a chat to us that you might have a question.
Well, let me just second your point, though. I think you're quite right about the bearing witness piece, and it goes to the point that dialogue is a reciprocity, right? I mean, a good diplomat, of course, strives to be an effective presenter and advocate for his or her, sort of the country's position and advocate for interest. But also, you have to do it right. You got to listen, and it's that back and forth, and you can't. It's not a dialogue unless one is engaged in listening, and in a sense, bearing witness to what the other has brought into that relationship as well. So I think you're quite right about that, and I wish I had stressed that in my remarks.
Well, you did. I think it's critical that and I think you've reframed it for many of us, maybe all of us, that it's not about the weapons, it's about the conditions that arise that make us feel the need for those weapons and then how we deal with it. So, but I see Anne has her hand up, and I think, Anne, you should be able to unmute yourself, and I look forward to your question. Thank you.
And Grant, if I could just step in for those who may not know, you can do what Anne is doing there with her little hand by going down to reactions and clicking raise hand. So that's one way to do it.
And I'll add too, because it's come up before, that if you don't like the color of your hand, you have the ability to change the color of your hand too.
I didn't know that. How about that?
Anne.
Well, thank you very much. My hand is yellow and kind of golden, so I'll keep it. Thank you very much for your talk. I kind of wanted to echo what was just said, that I don't think that your entire approach is just the first tenet of not knowing. I think that you've illustrated that they are not three sequential tenets. I always think of them as circular and kind of wave-like, that they change positions over and over again. And I think not focusing on the fact that we have these weapons, that's kind of a present moment conundrum. It is, it might not be what I want, it might not be what I like, it might be what I do like, but it is unchangeable. I cannot change the moment as it is. But I think that true Buddhist practice teaches us to engage in that moment in an authentic and intimate way. And I think you've smashed the stereotype of the pacifist Buddhist who just kind of stands there and lets things wash over them. Two disclaimers, and this will be the last thing I say. I am a graduate of a product of the chaplaincy program at the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care. And I was only arrested once in my entire life, and that was protesting nuclear war. So, but I appreciate your position as a practicing Buddhist in this level of dialogue with the rest of the world. I think it's important, I think, to use the peacemaker tenets as your kind of main focus and tool. Just shows what vision Roshi Glassman had, and how these are not just kind of isolated slogans that are part of a pacifist, quote unquote, religion. This is really real world dialogue. And I really think you've done a great service to the world by incorporating that into the dialogue on nuclear deterrence. So thank you.
Thank you for your comments. You also point me to what feels like an illustration, not just of the fact that the three tenets are not sequential, but that they are not entirely separate from each other either. There's an interpenetration, if you will, of what lies behind them in ways this you've drawn out, I think, very, very well. As in addition, on the issue of sort of Buddhism, pacifist or not, it's certainly, I think, to some degree in the West, especially amongst the convert community, we probably come by that stereotype more easily than Buddhists in many other countries would feel it. You can certainly, tragically, you can certainly point to both historical examples and contemporary present day examples of Buddhist countries where there are, sizable fractions of the community, including the monastic community, who are, shall we say, not very pacifist to a fault. Not just open, not just sort of struggling with challenges of force in statecraft as I would advocate, but to my eye, going rather overboard and becoming cheerleaders for sort of nationalistic violence and religious intolerance. You can see that in several countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, for instance. There's unfortunately all too much of that coming out of issues in Burma or southern Thailand. Sri Lanka is rather notorious for that. You certainly don't need to look very far. There's been some really good historical work on the Zen community, but not just the Zen community in Japan. And it's, rather deep complicity in some really bad things, I guess is the technical term, during the course of the Imperial Japanese high moment earlier in the early parts of the 20th century. So there's a lot of excess, and there's we as a community aren't immune to slipping over the edge from that sort of open-hearted struggle with these challenges to going all in some ways that are just as bad in many ways as lots of other folks around the world have gone all in on terrible things. And so we've got to be careful of that. We're not, the mere fact of Buddhism doesn't give us a hall pass here. We have, there's no excuse but to struggle with this stuff. And so I got to be mindful of that myself, right? Because I don't want to slip across that line either. I'm more willing to walk up to that line than I think many converts in the West are. And I actively try to disabuse that pacifist stereotype, but with that comes responsibility to be self-aware enough that you don't either encourage or, God forbid, one's own self cross one of those lines. So we have lots of both moral examples and counter examples to be mindful of in the Buddhist community. But thank you for comments. That was I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Chris. While we wait for the next question, I think noticing and realizing that several people are on this call who may not be familiar with the three tenets as they're listed. And of course, because our language requires them to be listed linearly, we have 1 and 2 you've heard: not knowing and bearing witness. The third one, though, is as interwoven as Chris, I think was the word, or was that the right? Anyway, is taking action. So it's from the interactive bearing witness, not with a not knowing mind, and then what arises from your heart. And Chris spoke of the heart before. The heart has to be in the right place to be able to act in the most wise way, given what you've seen as you've borne witness to what's going on around you. I do have. Well, you know what? I'll save my question because I see Genjo's up. So Genjo, please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
I think, Jim's got his hand up as well too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Chris, is it Chris or Christopher? Which do you prefer?
Don't much care. Chris is perfectly fine.
Okay, Chris. Thank you for doing what you're doing and have been doing, and that it got passed on to the next administration current administration is wonderful. And if you have any update about what might be going on to continue your work, I'd be very interested. For myself, I've long been a conscientious objector and war tax resistor, and I just don't want to give my money to governments who are, in my name, perpetuating violence or playing with weapons of mass destruction. But I love your work, and I'm happy to know you and be associated with you in this small way. I am interested in, what senator did you work for? What presidents have you worked for? And what do you know of how the work is continuing today?
Sure. As you will have gathered, I am, of course, a person of the Republican side of the aisle in Washington, but I come out of what now seems almost a kind of a quaint tradition of big tent Republicanism. I've worked for 5 different senators over the years, 5 different committee staffs, and senators ranging in their political complexion from Richard Shelby of Alabama to Susan Collins of Maine. And if you follow this sort of Senate scene, that's a pretty big spread. Although these days I've lost my ability to sort of understand how. I used to think that I understood how sort of politics worked in Washington and things of that nature. I'm a little at sea today, I'm afraid, but I've had a pretty broad range of experience with different pieces of the more conservative side of the aisle. In terms of where the Send dialogue is going now, I don't have any direct information. If they proceed on course, which I have sort of informal understandings they intend to do, those 3 work groups will be finally sitting down, maybe they are already, to try to look at those 3 questions that I mentioned. And I don't know what comes of that exactly. We tried very hard. It was a big point of principle because, as you might imagine, when we sort of began to get this initiative underway, people were always asking us, so what do you envision coming out of this? Is this going to be, are they going to negotiate a treaty or a resolution, or is there going to be a set of recommendations, or whatever it may be? Approaching this as a very conventional sort of linear policy problem, and the answer, the honest answer was, I don't know. We didn't want to be coming at this with an idea, a pre-cooked idea of what the outcome should be. And we wanted very much for it to be left to the participants in the process to decide what they felt was most appropriate after they had been through the process. And then to, who knows, what they, to take what steps they can agree upon and think are appropriate then. But, Lord, no way did we want to be seen to prejudge that. So I honestly don't have a clue as to what's going to come out of this, nor when, because the timing, the same thing can be said about the timing. Are you aiming for a deliverable by the end of the administration? Well, no, we're not. That's too early. But what's after that? Like, I really don't want to be in the business of saying. And it needs to arise organically, to be an emergent property, if you will, to talk complexity theory. It needs to come out of those interactions in a sort of way that is true to those dynamics, and it's got to be something that has buy-in from the people in the countries involved. And because the whole point is to affect, in effect, by in a sense by agreement, to affect change in the security environment. There are lots of examples of people getting together and writing what they think is the right treaty or the right report or the right recommendation, and then expecting everyone else will sort of flock to it just because it's pretty good. And what we were hoping this would do is actually have a process that created a degree of buy-in from the participants by virtue of the very participating. And you can't talk about that much in advance. So I hope they are going back to this. I hope that they will be shifting back to in-person meetings. We were, the last year of the administration, we were unfortunately stuck in having to do, giant Zoom convocations, which is better than not talking, but it's not the same as being there in person, especially when being there in person means you can also go hang out at the water cooler or the coffee bar afterwards, or if you do it at a conference center, as we did once in Wilton Park in the UK, then many people are staying on site and you get to hang out in the bar for those who drink afterwards. And those kinds of interactions between the participants are incredibly valuable in terms of building what you need to build in this process. And so I hope they get back to that. And I hope, as I say, I wish them Godspeed. I think they will, but I don't have any concrete data yet. They're not really staffed up fully yet. My successor hasn't been confirmed in either of the two roles that I had, for example. So I would be surprised if they were doing too very much just yet, but I hope it comes soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Jim?
Hi, yeah. Really fascinating talk, has triggered a lot of interesting thoughts for me. I'm interested from your perspective. We talk about nuclear weapons through the lens of nation states or countries. Countries have arsenals, countries have dialogues between them, countries own nuclear weapons. As an individual who is very focused on your third tenet of taking action to try and get my country to act in certain ways, I know how difficult it is for sentient beings to actually impact their nation state or country. And I'm curious on, as you look at yourself as a sentient being versus having interacted in this world of, say, 40 or 50 dominant countries in a world with 180 some countries, how you view the morality and responsibility and sentient natures of countries versus the billion individuals?
Wow, that's hard to answer. Great question, though. I mean, a country is, of course, an abstraction. It's a fiction, if you will. It's an important fiction. I mean, the self is a fiction. We all know this as Buddhists, of course. That doesn't mean the self is irrelevant or not a perfectly good way to to approach the world as if selves were real is a perfectly good and reasonable thing to do, as long as you don't, mistake it for being more than it is, right? I don't like walking into doors. That's not a very constructive way to get into the next room. So I have to, it's okay to act as if there were a self in ways that are skillful. But it's also important not to reify it in ways that confuse you and get in the way, where it's not so useful. And in this context, for purposes of send, my judgment in effect was that, although I didn't put it in those terms, perhaps I should have, was that the fiction of the nation state was useful for these purposes, because it's the nation state, for better or for worse, that it controls the bureaucracy that builds things and can dismantle things, right? What we have been able to do so far in getting rid of the enormous arsenals that existed, or most of them, during the Cold War, it was affected by things like civil society and lots of different things, but it was fundamentally a choice made by leaders of nation states, and not even leaders necessarily elected by the individual humans in a nation state, on the Soviet side, on the Russian side. So I don't know, for the moment, it feels to me like that is probably the most constructive framing, but it's not the only framing. And there are lots of other important efforts to frame this in different ways. And one of the more significant one in recent years has been the civil society movement that has been pushing for the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition but the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, so the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, as it were. A very, very forward-leaning civil society movement for quite a few years now, which has been pushing for the adoption of an outright prohibition treaty, roughly analogous to, say, the Chemical Weapons Convention or the Biological Weapons Convention. And there are a number of countries that have signed up for this already. You will not be surprised that the United States and and the other weapons possessors are not, nor their military allies are not that keen on this treaty. But that's another way to another avenue of pushing it. But even the TPNW has approached this through the prism of nation states. It's been a civil society effort to push national leaders into signing up to a treaty. So even in that context, it has fundamentally been one of choosing the nation state framing as, I guess, implicitly the most constructive, most likely way to try to do it. And there may be others, but that was the framing that we, at least we ourselves chose for SEND as well. So in that one respect, I think I probably agree with the TPNW.
Thanks, Chris. Alex, please unmute yourself.
Hi, I was just, there was some talk about bearing witness to sort of other perspectives through discussion and engagement, but I wonder what role bearing witness to the actual use of nuclear weapons in the past, for example, in Hiroshima, I wonder what role that plays in forming these kinds of policies and in having these discussions. Yeah.
Great question. And actually, I would say that especially in the civil society movement that has led to at least the drafting of the ban treaty. I don't know. I mean, I think it is now officially in force amongst the countries that, the number of countries that have signed it. The movement that helped lead to the signatures, that the civil society effort was very much involved in, we got a lot of additional momentum from involvement of some of the few people who remain who were in fact victims of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. There aren't that many folks these days, but there are some, and they were quite a prominent part of that. And so there's a bearing witness aspect there as well. I guess from the perspective of a sort of security-focused person, I would also say that we should, whether you do this directly or not, given the passage of time, I don't know, but at least sort of, bearing witness by proxy or by imagining, we also need to bear witness to the suffering of large-scale conventional war. We certainly had no shortage of horror in the 20th century without there being a nuclear weapon, well before nuclear weapons were used. And one of the challenges that I think we struggled with in the SEND process is this issue of, is it actually true, as so many have assumed in the disarmament community, that there is essentially no world with nuclear weapons that is not, let me see, am I saying this right? That is not better than any world without nuclear weapons. And I'm not sure that's a sustainable proposition. I mean, for myself, as I said at the time, in 2009, for instance, I would absolutely take, from a perspective of avoiding human suffering and a Buddhist compassionate perspective, I would absolutely take the world of 2009 with a pile of nuclear weapons in it, which is unfortunate, but I would take 2009 over 1943, over 1916, just in terms of the suffering in the world. And those counterexamples show that it is perfectly possible for humans to do appalling things to each other without nuclear weapons. And you can at least make the argument, as many have, that one of the reasons we haven't seen a 1943 type world or a 1916 type world. Since 1945 may perhaps to some extent be nuclear weapons, and that's, you know, not everyone agrees with that, but those are the kinds of things I think we need to struggle with from the broader perspective of what does peace and security look like for human alleviation of suffering and for human thriving. It's not necessarily just a weapons question. I don't think I mean, I would prefer a world in which there are small, you know, modest number of nuclear weapons, but managed wisely and carefully and by responsible leaders. And, you know, you could construct a world that has nuclear weapons that is, I think, qualitatively clearly better than a world of massive conventional war between great powers. Now, those are not the only alternatives we have, thank goodness, but I think framing it that way at least points to the fact that we have fundamentally to struggle with security issues and geopolitical issues first, and the weapons piece is certainly critically important, but not the most fundamental one. At least that was sort of my thought. But a great question, and bearing witness and imagining imagining the suffering that comes from bad choices in this arena is hugely important, and it's damn sobering, I suppose. But it's also, you know, it's sort of as a call to practice, it's pretty compelling, at least as I see it. Thank you for that great question.
Thanks,
I
Chris.
once gave a speech on these topics actually at Nagasaki, which was at the time pretty, well, at least this was in the George W. Bush administration, and I went there as the U.S. Special Representative for Nuclear Nonproliferation and gave a disarmament speech in Nagasaki to a group there. And I have to think, well, I know that many of my administration colleagues thought it was absolutely bonkers to do that, but I thought it was incredibly powerful and interesting. And it was reciprocated in the sense that at the time, the political leaders in Nagasaki were actively interested in engagement on these kinds of things. Hiroshima at that time, not so much. There was more of a, not unreasonably, but there was more of a sort of a moralistic hostility to weapons possessor sort of folk. But Nagasaki, I found intriguingly interested in having me come and talk. And I was delighted to come and talk. And there were survivors there, and we were on the scene. And I laid a wreath at the memorial there. And that was a really powerful, I mean, we were all bearing witness in a sense to each other. And the very act of having that kind of engagement felt to me at least a little bit like taking action to the third tenet. But it's a heavy practice, I have to say. But you guys at CPI are no stranger to that, with your bearing witness retreats at some of the most challenging places to be in and think about in the world. I know, Grant, you've told me a great deal about Auschwitz retreats and things of that nature.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I've been a fascinated student for decades on World War II, and in the middle of yet another history. And in your 2009 paper that you mentioned earlier, you mentioned a friend who sarcastically sort of said, well, I wonder whether these nuclear nonproliferation people really be happy with what they get if they get rid of this and we get into this full-scale conventional world wars that we had before. Because the thing that was going on, from what I've read, I mean, you know, we can all have opinions, but Germany only gave up when it gave up. I mean, when they ran out of, when we conquered and destroyed the whole thing. And I think Japan would have had that same posture. That was what was thought at the time, absent the nuclear weapon. So that would have been full-on destruction of Japan the way it was full-on destruction of Germany, perhaps. But it was what, 60 million, whatever the number is in World War II that died. We have the capacity to do horrendous things. So it's I used to wonder, or maybe I still do a little bit, how it was you were able to sleep at night with all that inside secret stuff and the, you know, at home. It's your, I mean, you know it all, in the middle of it, all of it, and know what the risks are at any given time. So thanks again for doing that. I don't see any other hands, so I'm going to go ahead and ask another question I have. And it sort of comes back to the Democrat-Republican thing and the horrendous partisan divide we have here. And then I want to segue in from your experience in the international world as a diplomat. Is it true what one hears, or what I've been reading, is that the divisiveness that we have is echoed throughout many other countries, within those countries and then the neighbors of those countries, so that it's perhaps even more difficult for us to find a point where countries across the world would feel comfortable in their own security situation and be able to pass whatever it is, to get this through their governments in a way that the people would support, to get rid of nuclear weapons. I mean, it seems like an impossible, Cohen. I mean, we can sit with MOVE for a long time, but I think you'd get there sooner than this one.
I wish I knew the answer. And even if the answer is a pessimistic one, I don't think one of the knowings that I think we can and should avoid is the knowing that says it's impossible, forget about it. I'm not willing to say it's impossible. And if you're not willing to say it's impossible, then okay, you should do some try it. That's not quite the same thing as having high hopes that it will happen particularly quickly or easily. I don't think that's true. But what it does mean is that, and it also means, I should say, that there's that third piece I mentioned in terms of the send question set of, and what do you do before that point? And, my appreciation for the challenges of getting to some kind of a sustainable zero is acute enough that I'm pretty darn confident it will take a while. Now, I don't know how long, I don't know what causes it to get to that point. There's a million things that one doesn't know, but I feel pretty confident it's not going to happen soon. And part of that, I think, means that from the policy community's perspective, we have a huge responsibility to figure out how to be whatever passes for, wise or at least non-stupid stewards during this interim period. And that's going to be itself a huge challenge. And I mean, in terms of the post-Cold War arms control agenda, the reflex has been since the end of the Cold War to think in terms of, okay, well, what is the next agreement going to be and how far will it cut arsenals? I'm not sure that's the right framing right now. Not that I don't want to cut arsenals, but that I sort of feel like right now we are not, unfortunately, able to enjoy the luxury of thinking about how to cut. We need to stop the bleeding of things getting worse. Right? The United States, thankfully, and I'm fairly proud of this, we are not building up our numbers. We are in the midst of a modernization program. I founded on the insight that I would defend strongly that if you're going to have them, they need to be ones that actually, don't rust and fall apart in the silos, because then whatever good they do, you can't do it if they atrophy in place. So, some people may find that very attractive, but those who point theirs at us are not allowing theirs to, in fact, they're already in the late stages of their modernization program. So even if you stay at the same numbers, there's something to be said for keeping them viable. And President Obama was pretty clear about that back in 2009 as well. For so long as we have these things, we need to make sure he actually was the originator of our current modernization program that has enjoyed a lot of bipartisan support for many years now. So I'm certainly not against modernization, but we are not building the numbers up. But unfortunately, the Russians and especially the Chinese absolutely are, and not just greater numbers, but a much broader range and diversity of delivery systems and things of that nature. We have to struggle with those challenges as a policy problem. And our agenda in the last administration for an arms control vision was, regrettably not cutting, but trying to come up with a way to stop the hemorrhage. Is there some way we can agree with Beijing and with Moscow on a cap, at least to stop things from getting worse? And that sort of is you really can't talk intelligibly about reductions over the long term if you don't even know how to stop building today. So coming up with a way to think about essentially a warhead cap in some fashion was the agenda that we were trying to pursue, especially during the last year or so of the administration. Haven't gotten terribly far with it, of course, but so I'm almost more of a mind to focus upon those kinds of interim objectives, because if we can't do that, then worrying about the end game seems purely academic. And I think we have too much of a call to engage this isn't just a seminar, this is about actually trying to make the world a better place. And so if you can focus on these, at least interim goals, and maybe we can find that there may be things that both sides of the debate can agree upon. short of, it may be that the skeptics of disarmament and the advocates of disarmament are never going to agree upon the end game. The skeptics may think that it's fundamentally unachievable, or it's not stable, or whatever else. The advocates are never going to agree to anything other than zero. So maybe you sort of can't get agreement about the medium to long term. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can't get agreement about some important things that we absolutely should be doing in the short term. And I think even the hawks and both hawks and doves maybe can agree upon some things, like measures to improve crisis stability, measures to improve the dialogue that exists between operators, not just in the nuclear arena, but in sort of outer space and cyberspace and some of these novel technology domains that could easily spill over into a nuclear crisis. There may be things that we can find to do that will be modest but important qualitative improvements in how countries interact with each other in the security environment that hawk and dove can both agree to, at least for the moment. The wheels may fall off the bus as you get down the road, but hey, if we can find some stuff in the short to medium term, for goodness sake, that sounds like a great agenda to me.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, it sounds like while things were challenging in 2009, they were far better than 1943, as you said, but it sounds like 2009 was a little better than 2021 too.
I do think we are going collectively in the wrong direction in the world.
Yeah.
The 2009 was, at that point, let me see, it was still 9 years before the Russians made public the fairly elaborate program of building a bunch of novel new strategic delivery systems, including this nuclear-powered cruise missile. I'm not talking a nuclear-armed cruise missile, although it's that too. It's designed to carry a nuclear weapon, but the engine of the missile is actually a nuclear reactor. So, they've been test flying a nuclear reactor in the air, an unshielded reactor, because of course, if you shield it, it would be too heavy to fly, right? So these weird novel systems, an underwater torpedo drone powered by a nuclear reactor is designed to sort of swoosh its way across the Pacific and create a radioactive tsunami in, say, San Francisco or something. It was 9 years after Obama's famous Prague speech about hoping to catalyze support for reductions that Putin announced this suite of new technologies. The Chinese have been much more openly building up their arsenal of late. New field and new delivery systems, party mouthpiece organs, such as the Global Times newspaper, are actively calling now for China to significantly expand its nuclear arsenal up to perhaps 1,000 warheads, which, by the way, is about the level that the Obama administration proposed that we might perhaps come down to with the Russians. So China is almost openly talking about strategic nuclear parity at this point. And so they're coming up fast, even at a time when the nuclear threats against China have fallen. Because of course, since the end of the Cold War, well, we've been coming down that 90% I mentioned before. You would think that if China's nuclear weapons, as they claim, are a reaction to the nuclear threats they face, the fact that both we and the Russians, the only two potential nuclear adversaries for China, the fact that we've cut our arsenals by 90% would give them lots of reason, at least to stay steady, if not to reduce themselves. But yet they're building steadily. The world is, and of course, South Asia, India and Pakistan, you talk about a scary nuclear arms race right now. That's the ne plus ultra, terrifying situation there. So the world is definitely in a much worse place than 10 years ago. And that's why my focus is really, at least has tried to be upon, look, we don't have to agree upon the end game and its details right now, but there is a femoral artery that is gushing blood and we got to find a damn tourniquet. And that's not the same thing as everyone being healthy and fixed and cured and prancing happy unicorns forever. But there is an absolutely immediate challenge that we have to wrestle with right now.
Yeah. Thank you. Miyoshin, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, as you mentioned, the end game, I'm kind of really glad that there is no end yet because of what you just said, China and also North Korea playing with their missiles all the time and threatening Japan. So, as much as I am a pacifist, I do appreciate the United States having this technology, higher technology in place to protect us, because without it, Japan is so vulnerable. And it's kind of ironic that, you know, the weaponry that once destroyed 2 major cities completely, or depending on it, is a catalyst for our safety. It's kind of ironic. But when you were serving in the department, how did you deal with these leaders who are not ready to have dialogue in honesty? You know, the program SEND is based on the premise that the leaders are interested in maintaining world peace. But some leaders are simply not interested. So when you were serving, how did you deal with that?
Unfortunately, unsuccessfully to some degree. You know, certainly we, like, well, really multiple previous administrations, never quite figured out how to untie the Gordian knot of the North Korea problem, for instance. You know, any number of efforts been made over the years. You know, for better or for worse, the previous administration's effort revolved around sort of a roll of the dice on a very, very high level personal engagement. Obviously, that didn't result in anything other than a flashy meeting that didn't change any facts on the ground particularly. I mean, it was good that the North Koreans, they did back off on some of their testing during the course of this diplomatic engagement. And I guess that's good, but it certainly isn't a solution. We hoped that it might have been possible to catalyze something through a personal engagement between the leaders, but ultimately it does appear that the North Koreans simply aren't interested in getting rid of their arsenal. I mean, the premise for the negotiations has always been, under multiple administrations, that, you know, so how do we negotiate them back to being at essentially a nuclear zero and in compliance with the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, from which they withdrew in 2003. And it would appear now that that is not how they saw the negotiations at all. And if anything, they probably enjoyed the seeming legitimacy of meeting with, you know, the most powerful person on the planet, and didn't give anything meaningful in return for this. And so that was a great frustration. We had an entire interagency effort set up to support denuclearization. The fellow who ended up as our Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Biegun, was originally brought into the department to be our North Korea lead negotiator, and to support Steve's function in negotiating. The idea was that the president would meet with Chairman Kim, and they would sort of agree in principle upon some kind of a denuclearization deal, and then all of us, you know, sort of technical policy wonks would go forth and implement. And we had an elaborate interagency process to build plans for how that might have worked. How do you, you know, sort of safely and securely and verifiably dismantle things? What kind of cooperative partnerships do you need? How do you have some confidence that you didn't miss something? We actually had some really remarkably effective planning cycles to be ready for this, and yet, of course, never the opportunity to use any of those plans. And I don't know what there is left to do, frankly, and I certainly do not envy the Biden administration. It seems to me that we kind of tried the last card, that you know, sort of building upon prior administration's efforts, and that didn't work. And I honestly don't know what they do at this point. And there may be, you know, the conclusion might be, I suppose, that that there isn't much of an answer except to try to manage the risks and do what you can to keep North Korea in as, you know, sort of padded a box as possible, and contain and constrain their ability to have these threats be worse. But that's a extraordinarily imperfect answer to the challenge, and that's going to be very hard. And I'm not even talking about Iran right now, right?
Chris, thank you. I noticed we're getting towards the end of the hour, and I have a question that'll lighten it up a little bit as we close, hopefully. I spoke of, and we both spoke a little bit about the rare bird situation of being Buddhists and conservative Republicans, certainly in the Buddhist world. How does that play out for you as a public Buddhist? And you know, there's been a number of articles about your role as a Buddhist and the sort of irony of working with nuclear weapons. How does that play out in DC? Is it something no one ever talks about? Anyone care? Is it anything come up?
Overtly, virtually no one talks about it, as far as I can tell. That doesn't mean they don't talk about it necessarily, but it certainly means that it's not an overt piece of stuff. And I mean, this kind of engagement that I'm doing now is really unusual for me. I only do this every so often, as you know, Grant. It's few and far between, in part because I don't think it's very helpful. I don't think it's good upaya for any policymaker to, I just think it feels weird, especially in this country with our approach to sort of separation issues in church and state and policymaking. I always feel a bit weird when leaders invoke their religion as a driver for their policy, and people do, right? I mean, I worked for Mike Pompeo, and for example, so I'm not saying people don't or that they shouldn't. It's just that I don't know what to make of that when others do it, and in the sense that it feels that is invoking a different type of discourse. In the policy world, we sort of, like Grant and I might argue about something, and Grant will say that well, we should do X because the data shows that that's the best way to achieve Y objective. And I was like, no, you didn't read the latest study. You got it wrong. It's actually, we should do Z in order to achieve Y. That's the kind of normal policy discourse that sort of wonks like myself are accustomed to. And when someone drops God on the agenda, I sort of go, I don't know what to do with that. It's a different type of discourse. And sometimes it's not a problem in the sense that, people of many faiths, as we all know, can engage with good faith and well across all of those lines oftentimes, but sometimes not so much. And there's always a danger that revelation with a capital R is going to get in the way of policy discourse, because, if you truly believe in if you truly believe in revelation, there's no discourse there, right? I mean, if the Almighty has actually told me that the answer is P, there's no point in talking with you about Q. That's just, it seems anti-discourse, and it's uncomfortable to drop that kind of heavenly stuff into a policy argument for me. And so I try to avoid doing that for the most part with others. I'm not sure it's that helpful. So I try to avoid putting others in that position too, but it does come up from time to time. And it always makes me smile, because every so often there'll be someone who comes to me privately and wants to sort of talk, over lunch or something about what their faith has meant to them and how do I see things through the Buddhist prism. And we sort of have this kind of completely offline discussion about how we approach these kinds of things personally and in our own heads and hearts. And I love those discussions, but we always do it really quietly. So this is weird doing this today. This is definitely not my normal comfort zone, and I don't know for sure that it necessarily helps, but I couldn't resist.
Those are the rich ones. And I wasn't, and sorry if I implied, I wasn't suggesting that you would use Buddhism, but I was wondering whether you got, I know as a conservative and a Buddhist, in the Buddhist world, I get people asking me, well, how can you be a conservative? I was just curious whether you ever got poked like that on the hill, like, how can you be a Buddhist and be a wonk? But maybe it doesn't come up.
It hasn't, and I suspect that is not because people haven't had those questions. It's more that they're just as uncomfortable with that as a topic zone as I fear they might be.
Cool. Well, I don't see any other questions, and we're coming to the end of our beautiful time together. And I just want to thank you again from the depth of my heart for your service to all sentient beings in the form of representing the U.S. in this such a critical area, and carrying the Dharma in such a beautiful way and sharing this perspective for us in this very complex area. So thank you again, Chris.
I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing you again in DC when I get back on the climate trail.
Well, look, I don't follow that stuff day to day, but from what I see here and there, you are at a really interesting watershed. For the first time, there are more climate-focused conservatives than I remember in my entire professional career. I think you've got a lot of work to do, but a lot of amazing opportunities. So Godspeed on that too.
Yeah, well, we're all in this together.
That's the fundamental point, isn't it? Awesome.
All right.
Thank you all so very much. I really appreciate you letting me take some time out of your evening, and it's been such a pleasure to talk with all of you.